Oh, hello there. Just about to enjoy a fine scotch here in honour of the man. So, just put that to one side. Have a little taste maybe later. Smells like scotch. Don't know anything about scotch myself. Now, some of you may or may not know, I used to host a regular show with MonteCristo about fantasy esports, a concept I know actually he is in favour of, because as a man of industry and refinement, but also leisure, he's an advocate of personal liberties, and that includes the ability to enjoy a fine aged whiskey, to smoke a Cuban cigar, to bet on whenever you may please, sporting events, esports. So even though he doesn't directly approve this message, I think it's in the spirit of MonteCristo and the way he's lived his life that my show is sponsored by esportspools, where you can go and play fantasy esports and bet on games, including Overwatch and League of Legends if you're still into that. Now, who is MonteCristo? That's strong. One of the premier commentators in esports is the obvious initial answer. Currently set to start in the Overwatch League, a massive league with a lot of money invested in it. Obviously, Blizzard's game Overwatch, set to launch at the end of the year. He's someone who's spent most of his career the most famous English language commentator for the OGN tournaments in League of Legends and for the LCK, as it later became known as, which was the best Korean League of Legends tournament and arguably the best League of Legends tournament entirely, because obviously the field was all Koreans, so in theory, stronger than even the World Championship. He's also famous for his appearances at international tournaments such as the World Championship, MSI, All-Stars, IEM World Championships. He's also quite well known in a very minor way for his SK Telecom hype train skit from the Season 3 finals. And today, the day I'm recording this video, the 19th of October, is his 31st birthday. So let's get to know the man. The thing is, because MonteCristo is not only now over the age of 30, but is someone who hasn't only played games in his life, he has had an entire life outside the context of esports. So in telling this his history and who he is, I didn't think it actually made sense to go year by year. So what I'm going to do initially is outline his life outside of esports. Because in the early days, he was involved in the theatre at his school. He grew up, I believe, in Colorado, fan of the Broncos, and he was involved in theatre. He played Richard III in Shakespeare's play of the same name. He then went and studied for a year in Ireland, in Dublin, at Trinity College, quite a famous university there. He came back to the US and graduated from Vassar College with a Bachelor of Arts degree, I think that's what you call it, in English. He then took a year off, this is quite an interesting detail, to undergo a Guatemalan Mayan adulthood initiation rite, which was essentially cutting himself off from society, didn't have access to phones, the internet, computers, etc. He lived a very interesting sort of sparse, ascetic sort of a life that if you want to know more about, you can watch my Grilled interview with him where we go into this in depth. And in fact, if you want to know more about Mayan myths, there's a book that I know he would recommend called Stealing Bonifacio's Roses by Martin Prechtel. Now, after that, he worked at a law firm in New York City for a few years. And around that time is when he began to get involved in League of Legends, and the esports side of his career then starts to blossom. But we've got to go back in time a little bit. During the time, I think it was when he was at Vassar, is when his esports career had already gotten underway, because with the alias MonteCristo, which he's had for a long time, you can find more about why he picked that name and what it means to him and what the actual book that's from there, the Dumas book, means. In my second Reflections interview, that's right, I've done 2 Reflections interview with him, and I did a Grilled interview with him as well, and he did a Grilled interview with me, because that's what we do. We interview each other for hours and hours each about arcane and esports related topics, because we are self-indulgent people, and also because we've loved their life and perhaps we're interesting to some people. So his first appearance within esports was in Warcraft 3, a Blizzard title. And he did some shoutcasting for one of the most famous Warcraft 3 sites, which was Warcraft Replays, WC Replays, where he also shoutcasted with Freak, and Freak was actually a player. now the League of Legends commentator for Riot Games, and he was actually the manager of Freak in a team called Verge. So we're talking now over a decade ago. We're talking like 2006 sort of era. Freak was one of the people he was a manager of, who's obviously gone on to become a Riot employee and a commentator in his own right, and a famed esports commentator. A player you may or may not know if you're from Warcraft 3 is a player called Sonky, who was one of the best North American human players at the time. And within this game, within his involvement in esports here, marked, I think actually, initially you might think it's not that big a moment, but actually I think a significant moment in that it introduced MonteCristo to someone called MaKNooN, who was the great Korean Warcraft 3 Night Elf player from South Korea. And so thus begins his love affair with Korean innovation, with excellence, which has obviously gone on to become a hallmark of his broadcast persona. While working at the aforementioned law firm in New York City, he became interested in League of Legends, thanks in part to a roommate of his who who went on to work for Riot, who at the time went under the alias Byronic Hero. He entered the League of Legends scene as a journalist because he felt like there was a lack of good journalism there. He founded a website called GG Chronicle, which looked to create feature content, podcasts, and interviews with top players. They supported a number of newer talents coming into the industry, and he invested a sizable amount at the time of his own money without making a profit from the site to try and grow the journalism of League of Legends and this side of the equation. So there was coverage for the tournaments. 2012 being the year this all took place, and 2012 being the year League of Legends first broke through to becoming a mainstream esports title and began to get top billing on the big tournaments around the world. He was able, through GG Chronicle, to gain sponsorship to run online tournaments, such as the Leaguecraft GG Classic, which was won by Team Solomid, then the best North American team. Still the best North American team now, by the way, but then the best North American team. This is back in April of 2012, so that was actually around the time that they became the clear best North American team. He also then began doing League of Legends commentary for MLG, whose offices were based in New York City, which is where he was working. So he attended the MLG Summer Arena, which was notable for being the first time a big Korean team came to a big Western tournament, and famously it was Azubu Blaze, the champions of the Korean League, OGN Spring, who came over and they trashed TSM, the best North American team, and didn't even let them win a game against them, starting what was then that year the infamous TSM loss record against top Asian teams and particularly Korean teams. He did the MLG Summer Championship in late August, which was unfortunately the event most infamous for its final being a rigged final between Curse and Dignitas, where the players agreed to essentially split the prize money and tried to play an ARAM in one of the first games, all random, all middle, and didn't play properly. And they were reported on by someone who knew this had happened, and they were in trouble as a result, and they actually lost their prize money. He would go to some of these events and he did interviews at them, sometimes as part of the broadcast, sometimes as a journalist. So one of the most famous was when he interviewed TSM top laner Dyrus, who at the time had a gimmick where he would bring a pillow with him that was his pillow, and Monte did an interview with that pillow. Thankfully for Monte, I know that he is glad that only a photo remains of this. There is no video of the interview, which obviously, looking back on it, not exactly a high point of his career. He then got the offer to move to South Korea, to Seoul, to work for OnGameNet, the legendary Korean esports broadcaster, most famous in StarCraft Brood War for the OnGameNet Star League, the OSL, the premier RTS tournament of all time. Now, they had already run League of Legends tournaments that year. At the beginning of the year, they'd run an OGN Invitational of 2 Korean teams, a Chinese team, and a North American team. And then they'd run 2 seasons of OGN Champions, which was their premier flagship brand tournament in League of Legends. The first one, the spring season, being won by Azubu Blaze over Locodoco's, wouldn't have been Azubu Blaze, it was actually Mig Blaze at the time, over Mig Frost, which was Locodoco's team. And then the next split was won by Azubu Frost, which was the new sponsor of Frost, over CLG EU, a European team. After that came the World Championship, and then we had OGN Champions Winter, which was the first season MonteCristo commentated for OGN, and it was won by Najin Sword over Azubu Frost, with top laner MVP of Najin Sword earning MVP honors for a superstar performance. He casted that season with Doa, who had already been casting in Korea, but now took on MonteCristo as his permanent duo partner. They would become mainstay duo partners throughout the Korean League and sometimes an international competition. They've gone on to be arguably the most popular duo in League of Legends commentary history, not least because that is a game which didn't emphasize duos much. The Riot approach was to have a whole cast of people and to mix them in for different games and to give people time off sometimes, whereas he very much did stay as a duo with Doa where possible. They casted the Korean League from late 2012 all the way through to a point in 2016. During this period, not only did they cast all the seasons, but they appeared at Worlds. Famously, obviously, this is where at the Season 3 Worlds, we had his train whistle moment, which was a big pop in the crowd because it was in the Staples Center. The final, unfortunately, was kind of lackluster because SKT completely rolled Royal Club 3-0. But that was a really big moment on the analysis segment before the game where he did his train whistle and gave out the tickets for the SK Telecom hype train, thereby establishing his hype for the best Korean team to win Worlds each year, which he continued to maintain and correctly picked the winner of Worlds many years in a row. He did the All-Stars tournament for Riot in 2014, including the infamous moment where he held up a cup for Deficio to cry into and said one last tear for Europe when a Fnatic got their head smashed in by SK Telecom. In Season 4 at the World Championship, he famously picked Samsung White to win, even though they were actually the second seed out of Korea, and the dominant team in Korea at the time was their sister team, Samsung Blue, who had actually also notably eliminated Samsung White from each of the seasons of Champions, which Samsung Blue had made the final of, including winning one and losing the other in the 5th game. So the obvious pick, the bookies pick, would have been Samsung Blue. That was the one that, in theory, you pick as the safe pick, but MonteCristo assessed the meta, the players, and the sort of tournament it was going to be, and he picked Samsung White to win, and they did in one of the most dominant runs in the history of League of Legends. Season 5 Worlds, you may well remember his banter during the semi-final between KOO Tigers and Fnatic, obviously Fnatic being arguably the best Western team of all time, and that being a pretty hyped up semi-final where people thought there were chances for both teams to win. He predicted KOO to win, the crowd started booing, going boo, and he obviously started to go, yes, that's right, KOO, yes, let's pick KOO to win. And obviously great moment. SK Telecom went on to win that Worlds as well. He casted a number of IEM tournaments. Later on in his casting career, part of the reason why it came to a close is, first of all, he became interested in working with Blizzard and Overwatch, and that timed it almost perfectly with issues he was having with Riot, including over the pay that Riot gave to freelance commentators who they worked with. Obviously, they use their own talent, but then they hire freelancers sometimes. And famously, for the MSI in 2016, they were offered a certain amount, was MonteCristo, Doa, and Papa Smithy. They turned it down. They wrote, I think, a public letter stating why they turned it down. They'd surveyed the rest of the industry in esports in games like CSGO and Dota and Call of Duty to go and find out what the average kind of day rate was and the pay for an event of the length of the likes of MSI. And they found that Riot's amount at the time was not at industry standards, and therefore they wanted Riot to get up to that level. Riot refused to and didn't invite them to that tournament. And as a result, he was not invited to cast Season 6 Worlds, even though that was at the end of his time in League of Legends. Also, there was an issue with Riot where they began to force the Korean broadcast, so OGN, to split time for some of the games with SPO TV, another broadcast company there. And so it was clear that they were sort of encroaching into MonteCristo's kingdom, where he had done all the games beforehand and was the most popular one. Now then, after that point in time, obviously he left and has been doing OGN Apex, and then later on set for the Overwatch League. Now, during his time in League of Legends, someone who casted a long time, was around the game a long time, there were many players who at different times were among his favorites. So one of the early ones I think you have to highlight is MadLife, because, I mean, he would often quote that quote, which I believe was actually an Obscurica quote, a guy who was a writer for his GG Chronicle, which was, there is no victory without the blessing of God, and there is no God but MadLife. Because during 2012 into 2013, MadLife was unbelievably good as a support player and famously would make impossible plays that would win his game the team. He was also a large fan of MaKNooN. You might remember his infamous Rengar base farming, where he completely disrespected the opposing team. I think it might be an incredible miracle, right? And this is a classic casting moment for Monte. There was also Prey, a player who used to play for Najin Sword, later on has since played for KOO, Rocks Tigers, now Longju. I mean, there was the infamous line, motherfuckers forgot about Prey, referencing obviously forgot about Dre from Still DIE. Well, it was actually a track called Forget About Dre, right? So I guess from that, right? Then there was GBM, who he was a fan of in Season 5, when he helped elevate that Jin Air team, who had a very interesting macro style of play. Obviously, Mata from the Samsung and MVP Ozone and White teams, who was a fantastic support player who really revolutionized how the macro game of League of Legends was played in Season 4. Goes without saying, Faker, the greatest player in the history of League of Legends, one of the greatest, Monte would tell you, the greatest in the history of esports, perhaps, who he has always found to be an exceptional player, transcendent figure. In more modern times, Gorilla, who obviously began and had big success in Najin White Shield, and then later on was playing in teams like Rocks, in teams like Coup Tigers. And actually, after Season 5, Monte cited him as a potential greatest of all time GOAT candidate, along with Faker, when you look at his tenure and the different metas he'd been through, things he'd innovated, and the success he'd had and consistency in his career. Now, his favorite team in history is a very easy one to cite because it is KT Rolster. Now, most specifically, the KT Bullets team of 2013 of Season 3, the one that made it to the final of OGN Summer, Season 3 Summer, where they played SK Telecom in the final and were reverse swept. And we obviously had the famous moment for Doha, actually, of the Ryu versus Faker outplay. And later on, because generally KT Bullets, particularly the Season 4 lineup, as well as the Season 3 one, they were often based around making sometimes gimmicky but brilliant reads to make a surprise play that would somehow win you the game. And this is a quality that's obviously very exciting, but they didn't do it in a stupid fashion. There was some logic, some intelligence behind how they went about doing it. And so Monte often supported many of the KT teams throughout history, even when they no longer featured many of these players, except perhaps Score. So, for example, there was the team in 2015 in the summer who made it to the final with Peekaboo, another player that Monte very much admired, and sadly were swept by SK Telecom there, and Faker kind of went God mode on them. As in League of Legends, he also played the role of a coach at one point in time. He was, for 3 splits, the coach of CLG, Counter Logic Gaming, one of the top North American franchises / organizations. Now, he had to do this remotely, except for a couple of weeks in, I think, Season 4 Spring, because he lived in Korea and he casted OGN. So he used to come online, he used to watch private stream VODs of the scrims, he would watch scrims, he would talk to people over TeamSpeak or whatever voice application they would use and coach them that way. Now, in the first split he coached CLG, Season 3 Summer, they had a lineup where they'd replaced owner and long-time top player at Hotshot GG with a player called Nian Tonso, who had before that played AP mid lane and AD carry. They had Chauster switch over to support. He'd formerly been the jungle the past season, and then before that, long time ago, the AD carry. And they had Big Fat LP, legacy mid laner of CLG, come back to the team and play the jungle role. It was quite an up and down split. It was a lineup that arguably was quite confused, and some of these players never played these roles in other splits. And despite managing to beat TSM, their main rival at the time, in every game in the split, they played them in the first round of the playoffs and were defeated, including the infamous Chauster fail flash crescendo into a wall. The next split, Season 4 Spring, he managed to coach CLG to a 3rd place finish. In the semi-finals, they had a heartbreaking loss to TSM 1-2, where Link got caught in, I think it was a Karma Penta for Bjergsen, if I remember correctly. And then TSM went on into the final and were crushed by Cloud9. In the 3rd place game, I believe they beat I Will Dominate's Curse team. And that was the season where Chauster had been replaced by Afromu, who obviously went on to become a great player in CLG and do amazing things, and was one of the players Monte was closer with, especially in terms of vision for how to play the game, how to play out lane swaps, how to play out early game scenarios and invades, how to play out splitting the map and macroing correctly. And I think you can see some of the legacy of Monte continuing on in CLG in later iterations, thanks to what Afromu was able to do and kind of the synergy they had as coach and sometime shot caller at the time. Obviously, he had his issues with the main shot caller, Link, who is someone who they didn't really have a good personality mesh, and they were in different places at the same time. So, unfortunately, that was their best ever place, 3rd place. In the summer season of Season 4, they were leading the LCS at one point in time. It was a very competitive season where like 5 teams were tied for 1st place at one point in time. They had the best bot lane in NA, Doublelift and Afromu, who were very dominant. The Rush Hour bot lane. Unfortunately, late in the split, as things started to get rough, they had a disastrous Korean bootcamp where he brought them to Korea thinking they could scrim Korean teams. They would have their subs play the games, which they ended up losing in LCS because it didn't matter. They would get into the playoffs and they hoped they would do well and go to Worlds. Unfortunately, in the first round of the playoffs, they were crushed by Xpecial, who famously always used to beat CLG. Xpecial's Curse team, where he really outplayed Afromu at the support position, and Voyboy played a very good mid lane. And then in the 5th to 6th decider, they lost to Dignitas, and therefore they had to go into relegations. CLG chose not to accept his help for the relegation period in terms of coaching, and also chose not to re-sign him for the next year, because understandably he would have had to move from South Korea and give up casting OGN if he really wanted to invest in being a full-on coach, and they no longer wanted a remote coach. Now, another role MonteCristo has played in esports is as an owner. He actually owned his own LCS team for 2 splits, Renegades. Now, he had a bunch of players within the team who he'd long respected in esports, such as Alex Ich, legendary mid laner of Moscow 5 and Gambit. He had Crumbs, who was a jungler and top laner for teams such as Curse and Dignitas, and also a friend of Monte's who's in fact gone on to replace him in some degree as a color commentator of LCK. And he had Freeze, I think he's from Czech Republic, right? Who's AD carry from Europe, played in teams like Copenhagen Wolves and NIP, and later on, obviously, Renegades, and was the hard carry of Renegades at this point in time. Unfortunately, his time as an owner ended quite acrimoniously, thanks to some bullshit on the part of Riot, where they claimed he had an unsafe environment for his team, and that he was planning to transfer ownership to someone, Chris Badawi, who had formerly been an owner of the team and who had been banned, despite the fact no evidence has ever been procured to suggest as much, and MonteCristo to this day maintains there is no evidence of such. Despite this, he was banned from ownership, forced to sell his team. He sold it eventually to Envious, who took over the team, and thus ended the ownership part of his career. Now, with all these factors combined, his casting coming to an end in League of Legends, with problems at MSI and Riot, and them encroaching on the Korean territory, and getting banned from owning his team, the timing was perfect that he already was in position to get a contract with Blizzard for the upcoming Overwatch League, which obviously is going to begin late 2017. So in 2016, he already had started to cast Overwatch when OGN began their tournaments, the Apex tournaments. He became a Blizzard employee. He will obviously cast and star in the Overwatch League. In Overwatch, we've already seen certain players catch his eye and seemingly align with the values he likes in players. So we got the mechanical master Nanohana, aka Flower from LW Blue, Luxury Watch Blue. We've had Tavik, who obviously formerly was in Rogue and now Misfits, who famous for his ability to play many different heroes. Miro, who has been at times very impressive when certain supports have been available for the Lunatic-hai team, and another Lunatic-hai player. I would think Monte would argue he's probably the best Overwatch player in the world and in history so far. Ryu Jehong, who's also from Lunatic-hai and is in many ways an exceptional all-around player. And then another Western player would be Taimu from Envious, who Monte would probably hail as perhaps the best DPS player in the world because of his fantastic hit scan aim. Now, as well as being a commentator, desk analyst, by the way, someone I modeled some of my analysis career upon, a coach, owner of a team, transitioning to a second game, MonteCristo has also been involved in producing quite a lot of content over the years. So he and I actually had our own League of Legends talk show over on a channel called InsightOnEsports called Summoning Insight. We began it on the 6th of March in 2014. We did, I think, something like 79 episodes of it. We famously not only had pro players and other casters and other journalists on the show, but we would also sometimes, well, for each Worlds, we would have a mega Worlds episode. We would invite on a lot of people in a row to make predictions about it and have a lot of fun. Obviously, there was a lot of banter, but there was a lot of analysis as well. We had a moment during the early days where we had our infamous TSM feud, where Reginald blacklisted the website I worked for at the time, On Gamers, and made a video saying that he wouldn't do content with us, in part because he felt like we were trashing his team on Summoning Insight, which is nonsense, because first of all, we make fun of every team, and we certainly were not unfair to TSM at the time in our analysis of the game. Now, on this show, he really was able to push forwards his persona and develop it and refine it of being this Korean elitist who only cares about the highest level of play and the best Korean teams in contrast to the West, of shitting on or making fun of NA teams such as TSM or European teams in the case of Fnatic in Season 5, where their fans went overboard, imagining they were as good as the second best Korean team, etc., and had a chance to win Worlds. He didn't only do Summoning Insight, though. He also did the countdown of MonteCristo for OGN, where he would count down the best games of the week and particular moments of it. And in Overwatch, we have started our own Summoning Insight-esque show, Oversight, where we invite on, again, professional players, coaches, members of the community, journalists, and try to have in-depth discussions, but with fun, with entertainment value, and with showmanship, and I would hope at this point in time, loved, legendary, entertaining duo. I will end this episode not with quotes from Byron. I've often modelled our friendship as a sort of Byron-Shelley relationship. I've never told him that, by the way, but and there's certainly no implication for you-know-what. Well, who knows? We're all comfortable in our sexuality. I could obviously quote something from the Count of MonteCristo. I could go with Moby Dick, one of Monte's favourites. Or I could go with Parzival, legendary alchemical Christian Grail text. I won't go with any of that. I will actually flaunt convention, as I would hope MonteCristo would appreciate, and I will paraphrase one of Snoop Dogg's verses from the Pax Life remix on the posthumous Tupac album, Pax Life. And I will say, and you know that I was true, because I took the focus off of me to do some of the insight with you. And we became the most hunted together, two of TSM's most wanted. And our relationship was genuine. Want to know how I know about Monte's life? Cuz is a friend of mine.
Hey, this is Huck. If you want to watch this top 3 asshole keep doing esports content, subscribe to Thorin's YouTube channel.